The footage is 4 minutes and 9 seconds long. I have watched it more times than I can count, and I mean that literally. I stopped keeping a log after the first 2 years because the number felt like an indictment of my own sanity, and the number was already past 8,000 by then. 4 minutes and 9 seconds. The camera timestamp puts the start at 3:17 in the afternoon on October 14th of 2016, which was a Wednesday, which I know because I checked the log book that morning, and the notation for that day reads simply SE4 rotation pending, Trout Creek Zone, schedule for first week of November. Just a routine entry. The rest of that afternoon and the October that followed it, and the 4 minutes and 9 seconds on that SD card, turned that routine entry into something I will still be holding when I die. My name is Scott Campbell. I'm a wildlife technician with the United States Forest Service, Wapiti Ranger District, Shoshone National Forest, out of the district office in Cody, Wyoming. I've been with this district since 2001. Before that, I spent 4 years at the Bighorn National Forest in northern Wyoming, doing mule deer population surveys and the kind of general wildlife work that fills the first years of a federal career before you find the job you actually want to stay in. If you're new here, make sure you're subscribed. We put out new stories every week, and you won't want to miss the next one. I grew up in Powell, Wyoming, about 25 miles east of Cody in the Bighorn Basin. Powell is the kind of small agricultural town that the American West is full of. Sugar beet country, irrigated fields cut out of high desert by the Shoshone Irrigation Project. A single main street with a hardware store and a farm co-op and a diner where the coffee comes in mugs the size of soup bowls and nobody asks about refills because they just pour it. My father worked in irrigation management for the Bureau of Reclamation, maintaining the canals that brought water off the Shoshone River down to the basin farms. My mother taught second grade at the same school I attended, which in a town that size means you spend your childhood very aware of the difference between how your teacher treats you in the classroom and how your mother treats you at home. And the two overlap in complicated ways. I grew up hunting pheasant and pronghorn with my father on the benchlands east of town, and elk and mule deer in the Absaroka range every fall. And I knew by the time I was 15 that I wanted to spend my working life in those mountains. Western Wyoming Community College in Rock Springs for 2 years, then the University of Wyoming in Laramie for a degree in wildlife biology. I graduated in the spring of 1996 with a thesis on mule deer migration corridor fragmentation in the Bighorn Basin and a firm plan to spend my career in federal land management. I applied to every Forest Service position within reach and got a temporary posting at the Bighorn National Forest in '97, worked my way to a permanent position, and transferred to the Shoshone in 2001 when the wildlife technician slot opened on the Wapiti district, and I had the chance to come home to the mountains I'd grown up hunting. My wife Denise is from Cody. She manages a dental practice on Sheridan Avenue, 3 blocks from the center of town. We have 3 kids, all grown, one in Laramie, one in Bozeman, and one who went east and lives in Richmond, Virginia, and calls every Sunday without fail, which is more than the other 2 manage consistently. This house we live in is a 3-bedroom ranch on the west side of Cody, 11 minutes from the district office. The porch faces west toward the Absaroka front, and on clear evenings when the sun drops behind Carter Mountain, the light on the rock faces above the North Fork drainage turns copper and orange, and I have never once gotten tired of seeing it. The Shoshone National Forest covers about 2.5 million acres in northwest Wyoming. It was the first national forest in the United States, set aside in 1891 under the Forest Reserve Act, and it runs from the Bighorn Basin on the east to the Yellowstone Plateau and the Teton Wilderness on the west, from the Montana state line in the north to the Wind River country in the south. The terrain in the Wapiti district, which is the eastern portion of the forest, is Absaroka Range. Volcanic rock, high ridges, steep drainage canyons, lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce, and subalpine fir in the lower and middle elevations, white bark pine and open meadow near the crests, and then bare rock and sky. The The North Fork of the Shoshone River runs through the bottom of the main valley, heading west toward Yellowstone. And the side drainages come off the ridges in every direction, each one its own world of terrain and timber and water. I've worked in the Wapiti district for 23 years. I know which drainages the bighorn sheep use in winter and which south-facing slopes the mule deer concentrate on when the snow gets deep. I know where the grizzlies focus on whitebark pine nuts in late September, which trails they'll use to move between feeding areas, which creek crossings show the clearest track in the soft soil on the downhill side. I know the roads by number and the trails by feel and the landmarks by the names the local ranchers use for them, which are often different from what appears on any map. There's a ridge east of the Trout Creek drainage that every Forest Service document calls the North Absaroka Boundary Ridge, but every rancher and outfitter in the Wapiti Valley has called it the Gray Bar since the 1890s, and that's the name it operates under in practice. 23 years is long enough to know a place the way the place knows itself. The Absarokas are in my bones the way the irrigation canal schedule is in my father's. The wildlife camera program on the Wapiti district started in 2011, funded through a regional bighorn sheep population monitoring initiative for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Bighorn sheep in this part of Wyoming had been recovering from a respiratory disease outbreak in the mid-90s that had killed close to 60% of the animals in some herds. And the regional office wanted camera data to document the recovery trajectory and identify lambing areas and seasonal movement corridors. We deployed 14 Browning Strike Force cameras across the district in the first year. The Strike Force is a solid professional grade unit. No glow infrared that doesn't spook the animals at night, a reliable trigger speed, a polycarbonate housing rated for the kind of conditions a Wyoming winter delivers, and a straightforward SD card system that downloads cleanly in the cab of the truck or at the office computer without proprietary software. By 2016, I'd expanded the program to include elk movement monitoring in addition to the original bighorn sheep work, and we were running 18 cameras in total.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby, so if you want to check it out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
SE4 was a Browning Strike Force mounted on a lodgepole pine at the edge of a natural opening on the aspen bench above the upper reach of Trout Creek, about 11 miles from the Wapiti trailhead and 4 miles south of the North Absaroka wilderness boundary. The camera was aimed north across a game trail that connected the creek drainage below to a series of high meadows above the bench, a natural travel corridor that the bighorn sheep used in their seasonal movement between winter range on the south-facing slopes and summer grazing in the upper basin. I'd placed SE4 in August of 2015. By 2016, it was producing excellent data on both bighorn sheep and elk, with a mature bull in the 6x6 class showing up consistently in late September and early October as the rut peaked. The camera had been running reliably for 14 months without a sensor issue or a housing problem. I trusted it the way you trust equipment that has earned it. October is elk season in Wyoming. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department runs a limited entry quota system for most backcountry units, and the units in the Wapiti district area require a preference point draw that takes most hunters 8 to 12 years to accumulate. The hunters who make it into that country tend to be serious people, the kind who have been working the system and planning for a specific piece of ground for years. They go prepared, and they go with the kind of knowledge that only time in the field produces. One of those hunters was a man named Phil Young. Phil Young was 57 years old in October of 2016 from Powell, my hometown 25 miles east of Cody. He ran a small cattle operation on land that had been in his family since his grandfather homesteaded it in the early 1900s. And he had been hunting elk in the Wapiti backcountry every season for 31 years. He'd drawn a special backcountry tag through the preference point system and had been back every year since with a general elk license for the open units in the area. He knew the Trout Creek drainage the way I know my camera rotation schedule, by feel, by memory, by the accumulation of years in the same ground. He'd taken bulls from that drainage in 2004, in 2008, and in 2013. He didn't need a guide, and he didn't use one. On the morning of October 14th, Phil Young parked his truck at the Wapiti trailhead before first light and hiked in alone. He was carrying a bolt-action Ruger M77 in .308 Winchester, a day pack with water and food and rain gear, and a Garmin GPS unit. He had an FRS radio he used to stay in contact with his wife when he was within range of the trailhead. He had a cell phone he knew would be useless past the first mile into the drainage. He had a knife, a fire starter, a headlamp with fresh batteries, and the field sense that 31 years in the Absarokas produces. The kind that tells you when to move and when to wait, when conditions are right and when they're not, how to read the shift in a storm front from the way the wind changes in the upper timber. He was fit and experienced and well-equipped for the conditions. The forecast for October 14th in the North Fork country had called for afternoon wind and falling temperatures, and he dressed accordingly in wool-based layers under an insulated jacket with rain gear in his pack. He knew the terrain on the north face of the Trout Creek ridge from 3 decades of hunting it, knew which sections of blowdown were navigable and which were better left to elk, knew where the saddle sat and roughly how long it would take him to reach it from the trailhead at his own pace. He was the kind of man the Absarokas produce when they've had a generation or two to work with. Careful, self-reliant, completely without illusions about what the mountains will and won't do for you if you get sloppy. He was hunting the north face of the ridge above Trout Creek, specifically a saddle between 2 subridges where he had taken a bull in 2013 and where the elk sign was always reliable in October. The north-facing slope above the creek had been hit hard by mountain pine beetle in the early 2000s, the same epidemic that killed lodgepole pine across tens of millions of acres of the Rocky Mountain West. The standing dead timber had fallen progressively over the following decade, creating a blow-down debris field on the slope. Broken trunks crossing at all angles, root balls jutting from the hillside where trees had pulled free, the whole tangled mass slowly being reclaimed by young lodgepole seedlings that would be standing timber in another 30 years. Blowdown terrain of that density requires constant attention to move through. You test every foothold, watch for the gap in the debris that's deeper than it looks, give wide berth to the leaning snags that are balanced on failing root systems. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, Phil was working his way up through the blowdown when a storm came through the upper ridge from the northwest. October storms in the Absarokas build fast. The temperature had been dropping since mid-morning as a front moved in, and the wind that had been intermittent all day hit the upper ridge hard by early afternoon, moving through the standing dead timber and the leaning snags with the kind of force that shifts the probability on anything that's been holding by weakened roots. A lodgepole snag standing dead for 4 or more years, trunk diameter of about 20 inches at the base, came down on the north slope. Phil heard it go. The crack of the root mass failing, the rushing sound of the trunk dropping. He moved in the right direction and not far enough. The trunk came down across his right side, pinning his right leg below the knee between the trunk and a section of collapsed blowdown underneath him, and the impact threw him sideways so that his left side took secondary contact against a broken branch stub. He spent close to an hour trying to free himself. The trunk was too heavy to lift, too long to lever from his position, and the debris field underneath him made crawling impossible. He fired 3 shots with the Ruger, the universal distress signal, spaced about 10 seconds apart. He worked the FRS radio through every channel he had programmed and got no response, which was expected given the terrain and the distance from the trailhead. He checked his phone and got what he expected: no service. The Trout Creek drainage, 11 miles in on a north-facing slope in the Absarokas, is not a place where cell towers exist. By 4 in the afternoon, the temperature had dropped to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The forecast that morning had called for a low of 22 overnight. Phil Young was an experienced enough man in the mountains to run that calculation clearly and without panic. His wife knew he'd left that morning and expected him back before dark. When dark came and she couldn't reach him on his phone, she'd call Park County. Search and rescue would organize. They were capable and they moved fast by backcountry standards, but 11 miles of trail and an overnight at 22 degrees with the kind of soft tissue injury he was already feeling in both legs and his right side defined a window that was real and narrow. He lay there with that calculation and he held it. And he looked at the sky between the lodge pole tops and he watched the light go from the gold of late afternoon to the flat gray of early evening. And he kept still to conserve warmth. And he thought about his wife and about the cattle and about the specific logistics of what had to happen next and in what order. And then he heard a sound that didn't fit any category he had for the Absarokas. Low, sustained. Not quite within the normal band of hearing. More like a pressure against his sternum than a tone reaching his ears. He described it in the Park County Search and Rescue Report as a vibration more than a sound, like standing outside a room with a large diesel engine running inside. It came from uphill from the direction of the open Engelmann spruce above the blowdown. It lasted about 40 seconds and stopped cleanly without fading. The smell followed the sound by perhaps a minute. Phil described it as a strong, wild smell, like a horse barn in summer, but with a sweetness underneath it, not unpleasant. He assumed bear, which was the reasonable assumption. Black bear and grizzly both used the Trout Creek drainage regularly. He lay still. The rifle had skidded into the debris about 6 feet to his right when the tree came down, and he made the decision not to reach for it, to lie still and not present as a threat to whatever was approaching. Then the tree moved. Not gradually, not with the incremental shift of something settling or rolling. The trunk came off his leg in a single upward motion, lifted from the downhill end, and moved roughly 9 feet to the right. Phil Young said later the speed of it was the thing that stopped his thinking entirely. Not the weight, the speed. He lay still for what he estimated was a full minute, processing what had happened and what it meant, and then he rolled to his right, found the rifle in the debris, got his legs under him, and stood. His right leg hurt significantly. A hairline fracture of the distal fibula, the ER at West Park Hospital in Cody would confirm the following morning. But it held his weight. He looked uphill into the open Engelmann spruce. He saw it, not clearly, not for long. Dark, very tall, wide through the shoulders, standing still in the timber at about 30 feet. Upright, looking back at him. He held his eyes on it for about 5 seconds. Then it moved backward into the spruce, one step and then another, and the timber took it. And there was nothing but the wind and the creek far below, and the smell that was already starting to thin in the cold air. Phil Young walked out. He reached the Wapiti trailhead at 7:45 in the evening, more than 5 hours after the tree came down. He drove himself to West Park Hospital. The ER documented the fibula fracture, significant soft tissue bruising on both legs and the right rib cage, and a laceration on his left forearm from the secondary impact. He was discharged the same evening. The Park County search and rescue team, which had been organizing to go in, was stood down at 8:20 when Phil called to confirm he was safe and mobile. The Park County SAR summary, which I would not read until February of 2017, noted that the fallen snag had been displaced about 9 feet from its impact line and offered no explanation beyond possible mechanical advantage from surrounding debris. I read that sentence sitting at my kitchen table in Cody on a cold February morning, and I set the report down carefully and looked out the window at the Absaroka front and thought about what I already knew. I serviced camera SE4 on November 2nd, 2016. Standard rotation, 19 days after the October 14th incident. I had no knowledge of the incident at that point, and no reason to connect Phil Young's name or the Trout Creek blowdown to my camera data. I drove to the Wapiti trailhead, hiked in, pulled the card, noted that the camera position looked unchanged and that the equipment was operating normally, swapped the battery, and headed to the next location on my rotation. Normal day, normal procedure. Back at the district office that afternoon, I downloaded 8 cards from the Northern Zone rotation and started the image review. SE4 loaded last in my batch because it was the final camera alphabetically in the SE series. I opened the thumbnail view and began scrolling through the frames the way you do after a year of doing this work. A quick scan for species, individual identification markers, anything unusual, flag and move on. Bighorn ewe and 2 lambs on the bench at mid-morning of October 6th. Mule deer doe and a yearling at the game trail crossing on October 9th, just before first light. An elk cow and calf at the same crossing on October 11th, the cow's nose working the air for a full 45 seconds before she moved through the frame. A great horned owl, enormous, wings spread across the full width of the trail at 2 in the morning of October 13th. The motion sensor catching it in mid-flight as it crossed the frame, the camera producing an image that I almost kept for the district photo archive, but didn't because it wasn't species data. A large grizzly boar on October 14th morning, shoulder hump pronounced, gait heavy from weeks of late season feeding before denning, moving through the frame at the slow, deliberate lumber of a large bear that has nowhere urgent to be. I noted the grizzly for the carnivore database and kept scrolling. Then 6 consecutive frames of black. Not dark the way nighttime infrared frames are dark, where the flash still illuminates the foreground in shades of pale green-gray, and the distant timber stands in graduated shadow. Dark the way a frame goes dark when something very large is directly in front of the sensor, between the camera and the flash field, blocking the infrared beam entirely the way a wall would block it. 6 seconds of nothing, starting at 3:17 in the afternoon of October 14th. I stopped scrolling. I backed up to the first dark frame. In the lower left of that first frame, just at the edge of the camera's flash field, there was a shape. Not shadow, not a camera artifact or a lens flare, a shape in the near foreground between the camera and the lodgepole it was mounted to, which meant whatever produced it had passed within about 4 feet of the lens. The shape had a texture dense, coarse, the individual strands of heavy hair catching the infrared flash differently from the mass they comprised, producing that particular shimmer that hair produces in no-glow infrared at close range. Near black hair covering something large moving through the near field from left to right, moving upright on 2 legs. By the 6th frame, the shape had cleared the left edge and the camera's flash was reaching the bench again. The aspen, the game trail, normal. 4 seconds after the dark frames cleared at 3:17 and 10 seconds. A figure in the far field. I'm going to try to describe what I saw in those frames as precisely as I can because I've spent 8 years working to describe it accurately, and precision is the only discipline that keeps the description honest. The figure was at about 60 to 65 yards inside SE4's reliable flash range of 70 yards in open terrain. The Browning Strike Force in daytime infrared produces a black and white image in which warm bodies appear as bright heat signatures against the cooler surroundings, brighter at the metabolic core and dimmer at the extremities. The figure in the far field was large and generating a substantial heat bloom. Very large. I know what a bull elk looks like on SE4 at 60 yards. A pale, 4-legged form occupying roughly a quarter of the vertical frame, the neck clearly visible between head and shoulders. I know what a grizzly bear looks like at that range. Lower, wider, the shoulder hump present, the quadrupedal gait pattern unmistakable even in still images. I know what a mule deer looks like, and a bighorn sheep, and a person. I know these things from 23 years and several thousand SD card images. What was in the far field of SE4's frame at 60 yards was upright and bipedal and human in its basic proportions and not human in its size. The reference I had in the frame was the lodgepole pine at the left margin of SE4's field, a tree I'd measured when I placed the camera, noting 12 feet to the first branch as a standard calibration point for scale reference in the images. The figure's head cleared that 12-foot mark by a meaningful margin. The shoulders were below the 12-foot mark by roughly 18 to 24 inches, putting the shoulder height at roughly 9.5 to 10 feet from the ground. I've run that calculation against the reference data from the camera placement logs more times than I can honestly account for. The number does not change. The arms hung at the sides, longer relative to the torso than any human proportion I'm familiar with. The body held itself in a posture I eventually came to think of as neutral alert. Upright, weight balanced evenly, the arms at the sides without either the tension of a threat posture or the complete relaxation of something that has not noticed its surroundings. It had noticed me. It had noticed me before I'd loaded SE4's card into the reader, in all likelihood. Whatever had walked past SE4's sensor on the afternoon of October 14th had known the camera was there. I've thought about that frequently in the years since. The camera had been in that position for 14 months. It was mounted at chest height on a lodgepole pine in a well-used game travel corridor. The infrared sensor is invisible to the unaided eye, but something that had been using that corridor for whatever portion of the 14 months it had been in that position had had ample opportunity to observe the camera being placed, serviced, and repositioned, to understand at some level of its cognition what the camera was and what it did. The 40-second duration of the near-field blocking event, the 6 dark frames, is consistent with a deliberate choice to pass close to the camera rather than avoiding it. A choice to be seen at close range in a specific context and then to position itself in the far field where the full scale of the body would be visible. The 9 seconds between the end of the dark frames and the appearance of the figure in the far field is consistent with the figure moving from the near field to a position 60 plus yards out in the time it would take to cover that distance at a walking pace. It placed itself where it wanted me to see it. Then it stood for 91 seconds and walked toward Trout Creek. I am aware of how that sounds. I am a federal wildlife technician, and I'm trained to let evidence lead to conclusions rather than conclusions lead to evidence. And the evidence I had was SE4's camera data, the site investigation results, and 23 years of experience in the Absaroka range. All of that evidence pointed in the same direction. I followed it. The head was set directly on the shoulders without the visible neck that appears on a person or on any large mammal in my catalog. The hair covered everything in the image except the face, which was turned slightly away and in shadow. The body was oriented toward the right side of the frame, toward Trout Creek, toward the blowdown where Phil Young was lying with a lodgepole snag across his right leg, 1,100 yards to the east. It stood there for 91 seconds. I counted frames, 3:17 and 10 seconds to 3:18 and 41 seconds. Then it moved. It turned to its right and walked out of the camera field in that direction, toward Trout Creek, and the stride was long and even, covering the full width of the frame in about 11 seconds. The camera recorded nothing for the next 18 minutes. I've thought about those 18 minutes many times. What SE4 was recording in its field of view during that window was the normal Trout Creek bench, the aspen bench, the game trail, the huckleberry at the bench margin, the lodgepole in the camera's left frame reference position. No motion events, no trigger images. The PIR sensor was functioning as the images immediately before and after confirm. Whatever had left SE4's field at 3:18 and 41 seconds was somewhere in the 1,100 yards between the camera and the North Slope blowdown, and it was doing something in the blowdown for about 14 minutes before it came back. At 3:37 and 22 seconds, the figure returned from the right margin of the frame, moving faster than before, crossing the field in about 8 seconds and disappearing into the left margin. No return after that. The math holds when I check it. 1,100 yards at the pace I observed in the frames is somewhere between 8 and 12 minutes to cover in terrain like the Trout Creek slope. 18 minutes for there and back with time at the site is consistent. Phil Young's description of the smell arriving before the tree moved is consistent with the approach sequence visible in the footage. The shape he saw standing in the spruce as he got to his feet is consistent with the figure that had been in SE4's frame 91 seconds before it walked in the direction of the blowdown. I sat at my desk at the Cody District office until past 6 o'clock that evening. Normal quitting time is 4:30. I watched the footage on loop. I examined every frame at full magnification on the office monitor. I checked the timestamp data against the district weather log, which confirmed 34 degrees and northwest wind gusts to 26 miles per hour at 3:17 on October 14th. Then I copied the footage files to a portable hard drive from my desk drawer and took it home. The following morning, I logged into the district database and entered under SE4's October data. Camera malfunction October 14 through October 22. Sensor strike suspected, roughly 40 images unrecoverable, data gap logged. That entry is false. I falsified a federal database record. I am a federal employee and I understood exactly what I was doing. And I would make the same decision again without any hesitation at all. For the 12 days that followed, I carried what I knew the way you carry a physical weight, in the tension of the back and the chest, in the particular quality of 3 a.m. wakefulness when the house is quiet and every assumption you've spent a career building sits in the room with you and asks to be re-examined. I went to work. I completed the bighorn sheep survey analysis. I submitted the elk movement report to the regional wildlife database on time. I had dinner with Denise and talked about the kids and didn't tell her what was on the portable hard drive under my side of the bed. On November 14th, I drove to the Wapiti trailhead before first light. I'd filed a supplemental elk population field check with the district wildlife manager as the purpose of the trip, which was technically defensible since supplemental activity monitoring was a standing protocol in the district. I hiked to the Trout Creek drainage with my GPS, a measuring tape from the truck toolbox, a field camera, and a notebook. I found the blowdown. The specific site was identifiable from about 50 yards, the compacted and darkened duff of the impact zone, the elongated oval where a person had been lying on their back for several hours, a spent shell casing in the moss 4 feet from the center of the oval, and the lodgepole snag lying 9 feet from its fall line moved laterally, the butt section displaced to the right. I measured the trunk carefully. 19.5 inches in diameter at the butt section, 42 feet total length, a standing dead lodgepole at those dimensions, 4 or more years dead, retaining most of the heartwood density while the sapwood had deteriorated. My field weight estimate, calculated against the trunk dimensions and the moisture content indicators visible in the weathered sapwood, came to between 270 and 330 pounds. Not an impossible deadlift for a very strong person under ideal conditions. Not a lateral 9-foot carry at chest height from the downhill side of an unstable debris field on a 30-degree slope. In the soft mineral soil on the uphill side of the snag's original impact position, I found the depressions. 6 of them in 3 pairs, tracking the lateral carry from the lift point to the set down position. Each depression was between 15.5 and 17 inches in length and 10 to 11 inches in width, pressed between 3/4 and 1 inch into the soil. The pairs were spaced about 4.5 feet apart, center to center. I measured my size 11 boot track in the same soil next to the nearest depression. The depression was more than 5 inches longer than my boot. Along the upper face of the trunk, in the soft, punky outer bark where the sapwood had deteriorated, I found pressure marks. Oval indentations 6 by 8 inches each, spaced about 14 inches apart, pressed into the bark hard enough to collapse the cellular structure of the wood underneath. These are not marks a falling tree makes on its own bark. These are grip marks made by something holding the trunk from above during the lateral carry. I spent 4 hours at the site. I took 241 photographs, measured every depression, documented the snag's displaced position against the impact line, recovered bark shavings from 2 of the pressure marks. Then I drove back to Cody and called the Park County Sheriff's Office and spoke with a deputy I knew from a previous investigation. I told him I was doing timber hazard follow-up in the Wapiti backcountry and had heard informally about a hunting incident in mid-October. He confirmed a hunter had been pinned by a fallen snag and self-rescued without serious injuries. Couldn't give me a name. I filed a public records request in December. The response came back in February with the incident summary, and in the contact information section, a name and address in Powell, Wyoming. Phil Young. I recognized the name immediately. Powell is small enough that you know families even if you don't know individuals directly. I held his phone number for 6 weeks before I called it. In March of 2017, before I made that call, I went back to the Trout Creek bench on legitimate survey business, and something happened that made the question of what to tell Phil Young secondary to a question I couldn't have formed without this particular morning. March 8th. A bighorn sheep lambing survey was scheduled for the Trout Creek zone. I drove to the trailhead before first light, hiked in through cold just above 20 degrees. Clear Wyoming dawn, the kind where the air is so dry and transparent that the fading stars seem to go out rather than fade. I was a quarter mile from SE4, moving along the game trail toward the Aspen Bench, when the forest went quiet. Not gradually. All at once. The Clark's nutcrackers working the lodge pole tops dropped their calls. The wind across the upper bench dropped out. The sound of the creek in the drainage below, a constant low presence throughout the approach, seemed to thin to nothing. Total audio shutdown of the kind that happens in the Absarokas when a large predator moves through a territory and everything in the food chain recalibrates simultaneously. The smell arrived, the same smell I had been living with in the footage and in the site investigation notes. Musky, warm, piney, with the sweetness underneath. Alive and present and coming from the timber uphill of the game trail, from the direction of the upper bench. Roughly 30 yards, maybe slightly less. I stopped walking. I set the survey pack down beside the trail. I looked uphill through the timber. And it was there. About 35 yards up, standing partially behind an Engelmann spruce at the bench edge, the trunk of the spruce at least 35 inches across, and the figure's shoulders extending past the trunk on both sides. The face was broad and flat with a heavy brow ridge and a wide nose and deep-set eyes. The head set directly on the thick trapezius without visible neck. The hair was dark, near black on the upper back and shoulders, lightening fractionally where it thinned on the forearms. The color I would call espresso. That specific dense brown black of very dark roasted coffee, with a slight red undertone in the morning light reaching the bench. The eyes were brown and they were on me, not scanning the way a deer or bear scans when trying to locate something. On me specifically, the way the eyes of something with considered intelligence come to rest on a particular point in space and hold because they've found what they were looking for. I've spent 23 years reading wildlife attention. What I was receiving from 35 yards on that March bench was not any category of wildlife attention I'd ever classified. It was looking at me the way a person looks at another person when they're trying to understand not what you are, but what you mean. We held that distance for what I estimate was 3 minutes. I counted breaths. The figure did not move. I did not move. The wind was gone. The forest was completely still. Then it stepped back without urgency. The weight shifted to the uphill foot. The body turned without any of the urgency of flight, and the Engelmann spruce took it in, and then more spruce took it in. And then the timber was just timber. And the nutcrackers started back up in the lodgepole tops, and the wind returned across the bench, and I was standing alone on the game trail with my pulse in my ears and my hands entirely steady, which continued to surprise me all the way back to the truck. I went back the following week. Normal forest, nothing unusual. I sat on a deadfall at the edge of the bench for an hour and watched and heard only wind and birds. I went back 11 days after that, and this time, I brought a folding aluminum camp stool from the truck and a thermos of coffee and my field notebook, and I was prepared to wait as long as the morning allowed. The hum arrived at 9:26. Not as sound at first, but as pressure in the sternum, the subsonic signature of something large and close, and then the ears caught it, low, pulsed slightly, below the pitch register of any bird or wind sound in my catalog. It was coming from the upper spruce. The smell followed by about 50 seconds. The forest went still. I sat on the stool and breathed and did not move. And at roughly the 6-minute mark, the figure stepped onto the open edge of the bench at about 22 yards, significantly closer than the March encounter. It stopped at the margin of the tree shadow, and the face turned toward me at a 3/4 angle. At 22 yards in good morning light, I could see detail I hadn't caught before. The hands, enormous, the fingers thick and long, hanging in the relaxed open position that hands take when the arm muscles are completely at ease. The palms were visible when the right arm shifted slightly as the body adjusted its balance, and the palm skin was dark gray-brown, heavily creased and cross-hatched the way hands crease when they've been wet and dry thousands of times over many years. The nails were wide and flat, the color of old horn. The hair on the forearms had a slight curl to it, different from the straight, coarse texture on the back and shoulders. And where it thinned toward the wrist, I could see the skin tone clearly. The eyes at 22 yards held a quality I've worked to articulate for 8 years. Every wild thing I've observed at close range has a gaze of evaluation. It's looking at you to determine what you are relative to its survival interests. What I was receiving from 22 yards on that bench was something fundamentally different. It was looking at me the way a person looks at another person when they're trying to understand not what you are, but what you want, what you're about. An interpretive gaze, not an evaluative one. After 14 minutes, the hum decreased and the figure stepped back into the timber and was gone without a sound. I returned to the Trout Creek bench 14 times between late March and August of 2017. The early spring visits had a quality I associate with the beginning of any longitudinal field study. You're establishing baseline, learning what the behavioral signals mean, calibrating your interpretation of what you're seeing against what you already know. By May, I understood the 3-phase approach sequence well enough to predict it. First, the change in the ambient bird activity, a general quieting that I learned to read as the earliest indicator, perhaps 5 to 8 minutes ahead of contact, and then the smell, arriving from the general direction of approach and strengthening as the distance closed. Then the forest quiet, complete, the characteristic shutdown that I've come to think of as the Trout Creek silence. Different from the natural quiet of an early morning on the bench because it includes the absence of my own ambient noise, the shift of my feet on the duff, the sounds I make just being present, as though everything in the drainage is holding its position until something resolves. The encounters in April and May were at 15 to 20 yards, with the figure present for 10 to 20 minutes before withdrawing. The hum was present throughout each contact, steady except for the modulation I noted when I talked, and twice in May the hum produced a variation I hadn't heard before. A shorter, higher note lasting 2 or 3 seconds that came at moments when I'd said something specific. The first time was when I mentioned out loud that the snow on the upper bench had retreated far enough that the early huckleberry growth would be visible to anything doing an elevation survey. The note came within 10 seconds of that observation, and then the hum resumed its normal rhythm. The second time was when I noted, to no one in particular, that the bull elk from SE4's October footage had been documented near the Trout Creek Saddle in the spring survey. The same short note, the same 10-second interval, the same return to the regular hum. I wrote both instances in the field notebook with full timestamps and no conclusions, because I didn't have conclusions. I still don't. The encounters were not reliable. I'd make 3 trips and see nothing, then go twice in a week and have 2 clear observations. The hum was present on 12 of those 14 visits, the smell on 13, direct visual contact on 8. The distance at first observation decreased through the spring and summer from 22 yards in late March to roughly 15 yards by July. The encounters never felt threatening. They felt calibrated, as though the distance and duration were being managed from the other side of the meeting in ways I could observe but couldn't measure. I started talking out loud the way you talk to yourself on long solo field mornings. Observations spoken before they're written, comments on the weather, notes about what I was seeing in the terrain. The hum changed when I talked. The rhythm of it shifted, the interval between pulses lengthening, the way a person's breathing changes when they shift from monitoring to listening. I noticed this on 4 separate visits before I was confident it wasn't coincidence. On the 12th of July, a second figure appeared. I was on the stool mid-morning, the large figure present at about 18 yards to the northwest, the hum ongoing. I was writing in the notebook when movement in the huckleberry to the southeast registered. A different angle from any approach I'd observed before. The second figure was smaller, 6.5 to 7 feet based on the reference trees I'd been using for height estimation. The hair was different. A darker chestnut, brown rather than near black, with a warmth in the color visible in the July light through the aspen canopy. Lighter overall build, the shoulders narrower relative to the hips, the movement lighter and quieter than the first figure's deliberate, measured approach. It stopped at the southern edge of the bench, in huckleberry that came to about mid-thigh on it, and it looked at me. The first figure's hum continued from the northwest without any change in rhythm. The second figure watched me for about 45 seconds, then crouched into the huckleberry and settled, still looking at me, relaxed. If you've spent time in the backcountry and felt the forest become aware of you going beyond the startle reflex of a deer or the territorial calculation of a bear, something with considered intention behind it, something that knew what it was doing, I want to hear about it, leave a comment below. I read everyone. The behavioral difference between the 2 figures was clear from the start. The first was careful and measured, maintaining specific distances that it seemed to have established in advance, varying the approach angle but rarely breaking from a deliberate, unhurried pace. The second was more direct in its attention, less formal in its approach pattern, the attention of something that has gathered enough information from a distance to decide it was interested and was now looking for itself. I noted on that July visit it blinked at roughly the same rate a person blinks, which is a detail that sounds small and is not. Most wildlife blinks considerably less frequently than humans do in observation situations. The rate I was seeing from the second figure across the huckleberry was not the reduced, fixed attention of a predator or a prey animal reading its environment. It was something else. A female, I concluded. Not from any visible anatomical feature, but from the combination of smaller overall size, different proportional build, and the relationship dynamics I observed on visits when both were present simultaneously. In subsequent encounters, the two moved relative to each other in the easy, practiced way of animals with a long shared history. When both were present on the bench simultaneously, the large one held its position on the northern margin of the bench while the female ranged more freely, moving between the huckleberry on the south edge and the aspen at the center, occasionally stopping to watch me from a different angle than the large one was using. The effect was something like a distributed observation. Two viewpoints covering different angles of approach to my position on the stool. Neither figure displaying any territorial behavior toward the other, both maintaining their own space with a settled ease that spoke to an arrangement established long before I arrived. On one July visit, I tried something. I opened the field notebook and held it out toward the bench, open to the page I'd been writing on, in the direction of the second figure in the huckleberry. Held it there for about a minute. The second figure's attention sharpened noticeably. The body straightened slightly, the face oriented toward the notebook rather than toward me. It looked at the notebook for about 40 seconds, and then the attention relaxed and it settled back into its crouch. I noted this in the margin of the same page. Presented notebook. Shift in orientation. 40 seconds of apparent interest, no approach. I don't know what to make of it. I noted it and moved on. In subsequent encounters, the two moved relative to each other in the easy, practiced way of animals with long shared history. I hold that as a professional assessment, not a certainty, and I note it as such in the field notebook. In late August, a third figure appeared. It came from the northwest, from the direction the first figure typically used, and it moved between the aspen and the spruce with a loose, fast energy, completely unlike the deliberate, weighted movement of the other two. Smaller, 5.5 to 6 feet, with the same near black hair as the first figure, but moving with a lightness and speed that spoke to youth the way young animals speak to it. Proportions not finished, coordination still developing, energy outrunning containment. The face, when it turned toward me, had the most open and uncomplicated attention I'd received in any encounter. It looked at me the way young things look at new things. Completely, without guile, without any of the careful distance the older two maintained. It stopped for about 30 seconds at the bench edge and then moved sideways to a lodgepole pine at the edge of the open timber, one of the taller survivors of the beetle kill, at about 75 feet. And it climbed. Quickly and fluidly, with a grip, strength, and body coordination matched to each other in proportions I'd never seen. It reached 60 feet in about 8 seconds, settled into a branch fork, and looked down at me with brown eyes that were completely at ease at that height. I sat on the stool on the bench in August light and looked back up at a juvenile looking down at me from 60 feet in a lodgepole, and I thought, this has been here the whole time. The juvenile stayed in the fork for about 8 minutes. During that time, it investigated the branch structure around the fork with what I can only describe as methodical interest, testing the strength of lateral branches by applying weight and releasing it, working a section of loose bark free from the upper limb of the fork and dropping it to the ground below. It dropped the bark 3 times, once straight down, once angled out toward the bench, and once on the third drop in a direction that put it about 4 feet from my stool. I looked at the bark on the ground. I looked up at the figure in the fork. The brown eyes were on me with unmistakable directness and unmistakable satisfaction with the result of the throw. I picked the bark up and set it on the stool beside me. The figure in the fork made a sound I hadn't heard from any of the 3 before. A short, sharp exhalation, somewhere between a bark and a laugh, if a laugh were a single half-second of forced air. Then it climbed down the lodgepole in about 6 seconds, hit the ground without any apparent impact, and walked into the timber toward the large one's position without looking back. I sat on the stool for a long time after that. The bark sat on the stool beside me. I still have it on the windowsill in the back bedroom in Cody next to the fireproof box. Whatever I have been walking through in this forest for 23 years, this has been part of it. I simply had not known where to look. In the first week of October 2017, tracking a GPS-collared bighorn ewe whose signal had been stationary for 3 days in a section of the drainage I hadn't accessed on foot that season, I found the structures. They were in a small basin on the eastern face of the ridge above SE4, sheltered from the prevailing northwest wind by an outcrop and a dense Engelmann spruce stand. 3 lodgepole saplings had been bent at heights between 7 and 10 feet, and their upper sections woven into the branches of adjacent trees, forming a rough lattice canopy over a compacted area of ground roughly 25 feet across. The compacted area was bare mineral soil, not duff. The decomposed needle layer had been cleared and the surface packed to firm, smooth earth by repeated use over many seasons. A second structure, about 15 feet across, was positioned 60 yards to the southeast. A low trail of compacted mineral soil connected the two. The pressure track of bipedal footfalls repeated until the ground remembered it. The bent trees were not broken. The bends were smooth arcs, the wood fibers intact along the outer curve, which means they had been bent while living and had grown in the bent configuration over time. I examined the bark callus tissue at each bend point and estimated a minimum age of 4 growing seasons for the oldest bends and 5 for the smaller structure. These had been here for at least 4 years before I found them, probably considerably longer before that. I sat in the larger structure on the packed soil floor with my back against the base of one of the bent lodge poles and the woven canopy above me, filtering the October light into strips. The wind was moving on the upper bench, but inside the basin it was still. The smell was present, old, soaked into the soil and bark over many seasons of use. This was not a temporary camp. This was home in the same sense that a beaver lodge is home or a wolf den is home, occupied with permanence, maintained across seasons, chosen with purpose, watched, and kept. I wrote 31 pages in the field notebook that afternoon. Then I drove back to Cody and told Denise everything. I'd withheld it from her for 7 months, not from any distrust, but because I hadn't been ready to say it out loud to someone whose reaction I cared about. I showed her the SE4 footage on the laptop, 4 minutes and 9 seconds, and she watched it twice without speaking. Then she said, "That's what helped the hunter." Not a question. "Yes," I said. She held my hand across the table for a moment and then stood at the kitchen sink with a glass of water and looked out at the porch light and the darkness of the mountains beyond it. And after a while, she said, "What do you do with that?" I told her I didn't know yet, but I did. I'd known since November of 2016 when I copied the files and entered the false malfunction report. I called Phil Young in June of 2018, 20 months after the incident. He answered on the second ring. I introduced myself, Scott Campbell, USFS Wildlife Technician, Wapiti Ranger District. I told him I managed the trail camera program in the area where his October incident had occurred and that I had camera footage I believed was relevant to what he'd experienced. A pause. Then, relevant how? I said I had footage of what moved the tree. A longer pause. Then, evenly, I know what moved it. I saw it when I got up. 5 seconds maybe, and then it went into the spruce. "I'm glad you said that," I said. I wasn't sure how to start. He described what he'd seen. Dark, very tall, wide-shouldered, standing still in the open Engelmann spruce above the blowdown, looking at him as he stood. 5 seconds, and then it moved back into the timber without a sound. He described the smell that had arrived before the tree moved, which matched my bench encounter notes exactly. He said he'd told his wife only that he wasn't sure what he'd seen in the spruce, because she knew him well enough to understand that when he said he wasn't sure, he'd thought about it, and that was his honest answer. He asked if the footage was clear. I said yes. He was quiet for several seconds, then, "Don't show it to anyone." I told him I wasn't planning to. I described what I'd been observing in the Trout Creek zone. The 3 figures, the bent tree structures in the basin above SE4, the 7-month history of encounters on the bench. I told him the large one, the one most likely to be what he'd seen, was still active in the area. He was quiet through all of it. When I finished, he said, "Is it doing all right out there? Is it being left alone?" I told him yes on both. He said, "Good, that's good." A pause, and then, "Don't tell anyone else." We haven't spoken since. The 8 months between telling Denise and making the call to Phil Young were not months of hesitation. They were months of continued observation. I kept going to the Trout Creek bench on survey pretext and on my own time, watching the 3 figures move through their established range with the settled routines of animals in a home territory. The large one continued its calibrated approach to my presence, comfortable at about 15 yards by late winter of 2018. The hum present on most visits, the behavior as consistent and unhurried as a bighorn ewe at her lambing site. The female was occasionally visible in the upper huckleberry, while the large one held the bench position. The juvenile, which I'd taken to calling J1 in the field notebook, the way a wildlife technician needs designations, was increasingly present and increasingly close, the boldest of the three, with a frank curiosity that the older two seemed to regard with what I can only call fond tolerance. On one February visit, J1 came to within 8 feet of the stool while I was writing and simply stood there for about 20 seconds looking at the notebook before wandering back toward the timber. 8 feet. I could see the breath in the cold air. He got what he needed from that call, which was confirmation that what had stood over him in the Trout Creek blowdown was real and was still there and was not in distress. I got what I needed, which was to tell someone who deserved to know. The footage sits on a portable hard drive in a fireproof box in our back bedroom in Cody. A backup is in a safety deposit box at a bank on Sheridan Avenue. The 4 minutes and 9 seconds from SE4 on October 14th of 2016, plus 11 additional clips from personal cameras I've run in the Trout Creek zone on my own time since 2017, constitute the most significant undisclosed wildlife documentation I've compiled in 23 years of federal service. Possibly the most significant documentation of its kind in this part of Wyoming by anyone who has kept it to themselves. I've thought about disclosure many times. The BFRO database has reports from the North Fork country and the Wapiti area going back decades, and some of them, reading them now with what I know, describe behavior and terrain and timing consistent with what I've been observing in the Trout Creek drainage. I could submit the footage to the BFRO, I could submit it to a university, to Wyoming Game and Fish, to the Regional Forest Service Wildlife Office. There are good scientists in all of those places who would take the material seriously. What follows from any of those choices is the same sequence of events: institutional attention, field teams, camera arrays, aircraft, and eventually the kind of sustained human presence in the Trout Creek drainage that transforms a family living quietly in a basin of the Shoshone National Forest into a biological research subject. I've watched what that kind of attention does to wildlife across 23 years of fieldwork. Bighorn sheep that were comfortable around hikers become unpredictable under drone survey pressure. Grizzlies with GPS collars run 50 miles in 4 days when their territory gets saturated with research activity. The wolves reintroduced into the greater Yellowstone ecosystem maintained stable pack territories for years, then fragmented when hunting pressure in adjacent state areas started hitting the adjacent pack structures, and the fragmentation changed everything about their behavior for years afterward. What's in those bent tree structures has been there for at minimum 4 years by the physical evidence of the structures themselves, and likely much longer before I found them. The juvenile is approaching adult proportions. The female has silver in the chestnut hair along her forearms and around her face, visible in my personal camera images from 2022. The large one's pace on the bench is slightly slower than it was in 2017, and the sitting periods outside the structure entrance are longer. I read all of that the way I'd read comparable data for any aging but healthy wild thing, still healthy, slower, settled with everything it needs where it is. In the spring of 2023, I saw what I believe was a fourth figure briefly in the upper spruce above the bench. Smaller than the juvenile was in 2017, moving quickly through the timber at the outer edge of my personal camera field. Visible for about 10 seconds before disappearing into the denser spruce. I cannot confirm this. I've been back many times since and have not gotten a second clear look. It's logged in the field notebook as probable fourth individual status unconfirmed. If it's there, if the fourth figure is a new juvenile rather than some other explanation, then something has happened in the Trout Creek Basin that changes the demographic picture of the family I've been observing. The large one and the female would have produced a second offspring, J1, now approaching full adult size by my field estimates, would have a younger sibling beginning its own process of whatever development looks like in a family group of this kind. I've been watching J1 transition from the bold, openly curious juvenile of 2017 to something with a more measured quality in its behavior. Still faster and more energetic than the large one. Still the most likely to move closer than expected, but with an awareness of the encounter dynamics that it didn't have in those early visits. If there is a fourth figure, J1's position in the family structure has shifted from youngest to middle, which is a different kind of thing entirely. I've been watching for the fourth figure on every visit since the spring sighting, and I haven't confirmed it. Maybe I will before I retire. Maybe I won't. The field notebook will reflect whatever I see. The question I ask myself sometimes on the bench in the early morning before the hum comes and the only sound is wind and the creak in the drainage below is whether I made the right choice in November of 2016. Whether the right thing would have been to file an accurate report, let the institutional process work on what SE4 had captured, and allow the discovery to go wherever discoveries go when they're processed through official channels. I ask this question genuinely. The answer I come back to each time is the same. I don't know what would have been gained. I know what I chose and why I chose it. I know what has been protected by that choice across 8 years. The bent tree structures in the Trout Creek Basin are still standing and still occupied. The bighorn sheep lambing data from that zone, the elk population counts, the grizzly corridor documentation are all accurate and in the regional database. My professional record is clean except for the malfunction entry, which I entered knowing it was false and which I would enter the same way again without pause. I'm retiring from the Forest Service in 2 years. 25 years at the Wapiti District, and my knees have been sending specific career advice since the winter of 2022. My youngest is talking about moving back to Wyoming, and there's a grandchild due in the spring. I have a list of things I want to do with my time that don't begin with a 5:30 departure from the Wapiti trailhead in January cold. I've written a detailed account of the Trout Creek encounters, GPS coordinates of the structures, dates of every documented encounter, descriptions of each figure, camera locations, and footage inventory. It's sealed in an envelope in the safety deposit box alongside the backup drive. The instructions with it say the document remains sealed unless the Trout Creek Basin or the ridge above it is subjected to any formal disturbance proposal in the Shoshone Forest Plan revision process, specifically road construction, mineral survey, timber sale, or intensive wildlife research activity. In that event, it goes to a specific wildlife corridor ecologist at the University of Wyoming whose work on large mammal habitat connectivity I've followed for years and who I believe would handle the information with the care it requires. She doesn't know the document exists. I may tell her before I retire. I haven't decided. What I've decided is that the work continues until I'm not able to do it. 2 more years at the Wapiti District means 2 more field seasons in the Trout Creek Zone, 2 more years of SD card rotations and bighorn sheep lambing surveys, and the accumulated small data of a long-term wildlife monitoring program. In those 2 years, I'll produce official field data that goes into the regional database and personal field data that goes into the spiral-bound notebook in the desk drawer in the back bedroom. Both sets of data are real. Both sets of data are accurate. One is shared and one is not, and I've made my peace with that arrangement in the same way I've made my peace with everything else about the 8 years since November of 2016, by looking at the evidence and accepting what it tells me. The evidence, 8 years of it, tells me this. There are families living in the American wilderness that are not on any species list and are not in any wildlife database. They are in the terrain we walk through and the forests we manage and the drainages we monitor with cameras and GPS collars and annual survey protocols. They have been there longer than the management frameworks that cover the same ground. They leave physical evidence in the soil and the bark and the bent tree structures. that would stand up to the same scrutiny that any wildlife field data stands up to if anyone were in a position to present it, which requires that someone first be in a position to see it clearly and decide what it means and what to do about it. Those are 3 separate steps, and not everyone who gets to the first step makes it through the second and third without making a choice that forecloses some other choice. I made the choice I made. I've looked at it from every angle 8 years of living with it has offered me, and I don't see a better one. And I've spent enough time in the field to know that not seeing a better one from where you're standing is not the same thing as not seeing a better one, period. It might just be that you're standing in a particular place. I'm going to go to the bench next week, and I'm going to sit on the stool and drink coffee from the thermos and open the field notebook and wait. That's been the practice for 8 years, and it will be the practice as long as I'm able to make the hike. The Absaroka range in late May, the huckleberry leafing out on the bench, and the Engelmann spruce putting out its new growth, and the creek loud with snowmelt in the drainage below. There are worse places to be uncertain. There are worse things to be uncertain about. Something I haven't said yet. The hum sounds different from the beginning of the bench visits to the end. It starts low and even and steady. The baseline I've come to associate with the figure's presence in the timber just before the encounter proper begins. It modulates during the encounter, as I've noted, in response to what I say and what I do. And at the end of each visit, when the figure withdraws, there's a final variation I've been hearing since late spring of 2017. 3 short pulses evenly spaced at slightly higher pitch than the sustained hum. I've never heard this variation at any other point during a visit. It only comes in the last few seconds before the figure is gone. I have no idea what it means. I've written about it in the notebook with full timestamps and accurate acoustic descriptions and no conclusions. I've listened to it more than 60 times across 6 years. I don't know what it means, and I've stopped expecting to find out because the search for what it means keeps leading me to conclusions I can't support and away from what I actually know, which is that the 3 pulses come at the end and then the figure is gone and the bench resumes its ordinary business. I'm going to keep recording it in the field notebook. That's what a wildlife technician does. Next week, I'm going back. The road to the Wapiti trailhead is clear by now in a normal May. The huckleberry is leafing out on the lower bench. The bighorn lambs will be visible on the upper slopes, and the Engelmann spruce along the upper bench will have put out the pale yellow-green of new growth at the twig tips that the spruce does in late spring. That particular color that looks lit from within against the older, deeper green of the mature needles. I'll hike in before 7. I'll set the stool up off the game trail where the huckleberry gives me partial cover and a view of the upper bench. I'll pour coffee from the thermos and open the field notebook, and I'll wait. And I'll talk out loud the way I do on long solo field mornings. And if the hum comes, if the forest goes still, and the smell arrives and the hum starts in my sternum before it reaches my ears, I'll sit still on that aluminum stool, and I'll watch the Engelmann spruce on the upper bench, and I'll remember 3:17 in the afternoon on October 14th of 2016. I don't know what they are. I've spent 8 years working toward an answer, and the answer keeps not arriving in any form I can write in a field notebook, and I've decided that the answer was never the point. The point is what I watched on SE4's bench and in the Trout Creek drainage over 7 years of careful, quiet visits. The point is a family, large, careful, long-lived, occupying a territory in the Absaroka range with the deep familiarity that comes only from generations of use. The point is that on a cold October afternoon, something in the blowdown field above Trout Creek looked at a man who was going to die if he stayed there through the night and made a decision about what to do. Whatever carries that kind of decision, whatever understands the difference between a man who needs help and a man who doesn't, I am not afraid of it. I stopped being afraid somewhere in the spring visits of 2017 when the distance had closed to 20 yards and the hum was in my sternum. And the brown eyes in the Engelmann spruce were on me with the patience of something that has been in these mountains longer than any name we've put on them. What I am, as near as I can name it after 8 years of sitting on a stool in the cold with a thermos of coffee and a field notebook, is grateful. Quietly, completely, without anything left over for doubt. The bench will be cold next week. It's always cold at the Trout Creek bench in May. But the light lasts long in Wyoming in May, and the Absarokas are a different world in that light. The rock faces orange, and the new green of the spruce tips catching it. And somewhere in that timber, in a basin on the eastern face of a ridge that appears on maps by a name nobody in the basin cares about, in structures woven from bent lodgepole saplings and maintained across 8 or more Absaroka winters, there is a family going about its life the way families do when nobody's watching. I'll be watching. That's the arrangement it holds